Have you ever wondered just how many faith schools operate in the UK and which faiths they actually represent? Let's dig into the data, because the scale might surprise you. In England alone, there are about 6,800 state-funded faith schools. That's roughly 1/3 of all state schools, a huge institutional presence. Now, when I say faith schools, 85% of these are linked to the Church of England or Roman Catholicism. Non-Christian faith schools? They're a tiny minority, just 35 Muslim, 13 Sikh, and 7 Hindu schools in all of England. Scotland and Wales echo this pattern. State-funded faith schools are almost exclusively Christian, particularly Catholic in Scotland and Anglican in Wales. Northern Ireland's landscape is a legacy of its unique history. Over 1,100 schools split between Catholic, maintained, and controlled schools, the latter historically Protestant. So, next time you hear about multi-faith education, remember, the picture is overwhelmingly Christian, a fact that shapes everything from assemblies to admissions. Now, you might be thinking, aren't faith schools a reflection of the UK's religious diversity? Actually, they're more a reflection of its Christian legacy than its current population. While there are a handful of schools for minority religions, their institutional weight is almost negligible. This isn't just an accident of history, it's a direct result of how the system was built and maintained. The technical term here is denominational provision, public education delivered with religious oversight or sponsorship. Why does this breakdown matter? Because it sets the stage for everything that follows: funding, governance, and the daily lived experience of pupils. If you thought faith schools were a small, niche phenomenon, think again. Their footprint is massive. Let me tell you a story. I recently met a parent who was shocked to discover that every school within walking distance of her home was either Anglican or Catholic. "I thought the state system was neutral," she said, "but neutrality here is more myth than reality." So, the first act in our deep dive, understanding the true scale and composition of faith schools in the UK. Without this context, every funding debate is built on sand. It's tempting to imagine that faith schools are funded by their associated religions. After all, faith is right there in the name, so surely the church or mosque foots the bill, right? Time for a reality check. The vast majority of funding for these schools comes straight from the taxpayer. Teacher salaries, heating bills, IT equipment, special educational needs provision, virtually every running cost is paid for by public money, not by religious institutions. That's true for England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. In other words, faith schools are free at the point of use, just like any other state school. Here's a technical term for you: voluntary aided, VA, schools. These are mostly Catholic and some Anglican schools where the only expectation of religious financial input is a contribution of around 10% towards new buildings or major refurbishments. But even then, the majority, 90%, comes from the state. And that 10%? Often cobbled together from parent fundraising, bake sales, or parish collections, rather than direct denominational grants. So, what about the land? You might hear defenders claim, "But the church gave the land." And sure, some school sites were donated, sometimes centuries ago. But today, the public pays to maintain and upgrade those buildings. Ownership isn't the same as paying the bills. If the local vicar doesn't pay for the electricity, should they control the curriculum? Now you might be thinking, isn't there at least a private funding stream for religious ethos or extracurricular activities? In practice, almost all core costs are state-funded. The technical distinction here is between capital costs and operational costs, and for most schools, even the capital is 100% public. In sum, the myth of faith schools as privately funded sanctuaries doesn't hold up. They're overwhelmingly taxpayer-funded, with only minor exceptions. And that fact has major consequences for accountability and public values, which we'll tackle next. So if the state funds faith schools, who gets to call the shots? Here's where things get complicated and controversial. While religious institutions don't pay the bills, they retain significant control over governance and ethos. In voluntary aided schools, foundation governors, often appointed by the church, can make up a majority of the governing body. That means they set admissions policies, influence hiring, and shape the school's culture. It's a classic example of what political scientists call institutional capture. Let me throw out a hypothetical. What if you funded a community center with public money, but gave a private group the power to decide who could use it and what music got played? That's essentially the arrangement for many faith schools. The technical term here is public funding, private governance. Now, to be fair, religious bodies do contribute something. Ethos, the school's character, values, and daily practices are shaped by religious tradition. For some parents, that's an advantage values-based education, a sense of belonging. But for others, especially in diverse communities, it can feel exclusionary. Critics ask, should institutions with public money and public pupils be allowed to prioritize religion in admissions or staff recruitment? Courts have grappled with this, often upholding a limited right for faith schools to maintain their religious character. Yet that right is constantly debated, especially as the demographic reality of the UK shifts away from organized religion. So, the resolution: governance is where the rubber meets the road. Faith schools may not pay, but they still steer. And that raises big questions about who our education system is really serving. Let's switch gears and talk law. Did you know that all state-funded schools in England, faith-based or not, are legally required to hold daily collective worship of a broadly Christian character? That's written into the School Standards and Framework Act of 1998. The technical term here, statutory worship. In practice, some schools interpret this loosely, but the legal baseline remains unambiguously Christian. Now, you might be thinking, isn't this out of step with a modern pluralist society? You're not alone. Many parents opt to withdraw their children from worship, but for most, the institutional atmosphere is set assemblies, songs, the moral framework. Even non-faith schools become, in effect, Christian light environments, a soft normativity that shapes children's experience whether or not they come from religious homes. Here's a story. One head teacher told a local paper, "We welcome all faiths, but our hands are tied by the law. Collective worship is non-negotiable." This illustrates the Bind schools face balancing legal compliance with the realities of a diverse intake. Because the law sets Christianity as the default, it impacts curriculum, assemblies, and even the calendar. That's institutional inertia at work. The system runs on autopilot, shaped by decisions made decades or centuries ago. So, when people talk about neutral state education, remember, the law itself encodes a Christian bias. This matters for minority faiths, for non-religious families, and for what we imagine public education is supposed to be. Now let's crunch some numbers. According to the 2021 census, 44% of school-age children in England have no religion. Yet they attend a system where 98% of state-funded faith schools are Christian, and every child encounters mandatory Christian worship. That's a glaring mismatch between who pupils are and the institutions designed to educate them. Here's a technical term: demographic lag. The schools reflect the religious makeup of past generations, not the reality of today's children. Only 12% of school-age kids are Muslim, but less than 1% of state faith schools serve that community. Hindu, Sikh, and Jewish pupils are similarly underrepresented. The majority of children experience a daily environment that doesn't reflect their family's worldview. Now you might wonder, does this mean the education system is shaping young people into more religious citizens? Ironically, the opposite seems to be happening. Social researchers note a generational drift away from institutional religion, despite, or perhaps because, of the Christian saturation of schools. Let me tell you a story. I spoke to a teenager who described collective worship as background noise, something she tuned out, but which still framed her school life. That's the subtlety here. It's not overt indoctrination, but a soft shaping of norms. If nothing else, it raises questions about authenticity, engagement, and whether our institutions are keeping pace with the people they serve. In the end, the evidence suggests a system at odds with its population, a quiet generational shift away from old defaults. The real question isn't just who pays for faith schools, but whether their structure and ethos reflect who we are, or who we used to be.